At the dinner table last Sunday, my brother Marcus looked me straight in the eye and said, "Serafina, you need to get a steady job to support your daughter instead of chasing these ridiculous business dreams." The entire family nodded in agreement while my 8-year-old daughter Lily sat quietly absorbing every cruel word. What they didn't know was that I had just discovered something that would change everything. 3 days earlier, I had accidentally stumbled upon documents that revealed a devastating family secret involving our late father's will and a 20-year deception that had stolen my rightful inheritance. Before we dive into this explosive family drama that completely turned my world upside down, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below and smash that like button if you're ready for a story about family betrayal that will leave you speechless. Don't forget to hit subscribe because this revenge tale has more twists than you can imagine. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when the truth finally comes out. 3 days before that humiliating dinner, I was helping my mother clean out the attic when I found a dusty box labeled financial records tucked behind old Christmas decorations. As someone who had been struggling financially as a single mother trying to build my graphic design business, I thought maybe there were old tax documents I could use for reference. Instead, what I found made my blood run cold. Inside were copies of my father's original will from 19 years ago, along with bank statements and legal documents I had never seen before. According to these papers, my father had left me a substantial inheritance of $400,000, plus half ownership of the family bakery that had been in our family for 3 generations. The will was dated just 2 months before his sudden death from a heart attack. But there was more. I found correspondence between my mother and my Uncle Robert, who was the family lawyer, discussing how they had handled the Serafina situation and ensured that she would never find out about the original provisions. There were bank statements showing regular transfers from an account I didn't know existed going directly to my mother and my brother Marcus for the past 19 years. My hands shook as I read through document after document. Not only had they hidden my inheritance, but they had been using my money to fund Marcus's college education, his wedding, his house down payment, and even his recent luxury car purchase. Meanwhile, I had been working 3 part-time jobs while pregnant, had lived in a cramped apartment with Lily, and had been constantly lectured about my poor financial decisions and unrealistic dreams. The cruelest part was discovering that the family bakery which Marcus now managed and claimed to have saved from bankruptcy with his business expertise was actually thriving because of the inheritance money that rightfully belonged to me. Every time he bragged about his success, every time the family praised his business acumen, every time they compared his achievements to my struggles, they knew the truth. I found emails between my mother and Marcus from just last month, discussing how they needed to keep Serafina focused on small thinking and make sure she doesn't get too ambitious with her business ideas, because she might start asking uncomfortable questions about money. They had systematically undermined my confidence and ambitions to protect their secret. The final devastating piece was a letter from my father to me never delivered, expressing his pride in my artistic talents and his hope that the inheritance would allow me to build the creative business he knew I was capable of running. He had specifically wanted me to have the bakery because he believed I could expand it into a bakery cafe, featuring custom celebration cakes, combining my artistic skills with the family business. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was learning that my struggles as a single mother weren't just due to circumstances. When Lily's father abandoned us, I had reached out to my family for help with daycare costs so I could work more hours. My mother had refused, saying they couldn't enable my poor choices. Now I realized they could have easily helped me using my own inheritance money but chose to watch me struggle instead. The documents revealed that my Uncle Robert had created a fraudulent will after my father's death, removing all mentions of my inheritance and transferring everything to my mother's sole discretion. My father's original lawyer had died in a car accident just 3 months after my father's death, conveniently eliminating the one person who could have exposed the fraud. I sat in that dusty attic for hours crying and reading through 19 years of systematic financial abuse and emotional manipulation. Every family gathering where they made me feel like a failure, every time they suggested I was irresponsible with money, every lecture about getting a real job instead of pursuing my passion had been a carefully orchestrated lie to cover up their theft. That evening, I didn't say anything to my family. I needed time to process and plan. But as I tucked Lily into bed that night, I made her a promise that everything was about to change. They had stolen nearly 2 decades of financial security from us, had damaged my self-esteem and dreams, and had made my daughter witness countless moments where I was made to feel inadequate. The next morning, I started making copies of everything and began researching lawyers who specialized in inheritance fraud. What I discovered was that in our state there was no statute of limitations on inheritance fraud cases, especially when the fraud involved forged documents and ongoing financial deception. Marcus and my mother had been living off stolen money for 19 years, and they had no idea that their carefully constructed lies were about to crumble. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of strategic planning and evidence gathering. I reached out to Patricia Henley, a lawyer who specialized in inheritance fraud and family financial crimes. When I showed her the documents, her eyes widened in disbelief. She told me this was one of the most clear-cut cases of inheritance fraud she had ever seen, with documentation that would make prosecution straightforward. Patricia explained that not only was this a civil matter, but because of the forged will and ongoing financial deception, it likely constituted criminal fraud. The systematic nature of the theft involving multiple family members over nearly 2 decades elevated it to felony charges. She estimated that with interest and damages, I could be looking at recovering over $800,000. But I wanted more than just money. I wanted accountability and public exposure. Patricia advised me to gather additional evidence before we made any legal moves, so I spent the weekend playing detective in my own family's life. I started by casually visiting my mother under the pretense of helping her organize more of Dad's belongings. While she was in the garden, I photographed additional documents in her home office, including recent financial statements that showed the inheritance money was still being actively managed and distributed. I discovered that she had been giving Marcus monthly allowances of $3,000, supposedly from her retirement savings. Next, I drove by the bakery and took photos of the recent renovations Marcus had bragged about at family gatherings. The new equipment, expanded seating area, and custom display cases had cost at least $50,000 according to the invoices I glimpsed through the window, all funded by money that should have been building Lily's college fund and securing our future. The most damaging evidence came when I remembered that my tech-savvy cousin Jake had helped digitize family photos last year and had access to my mother's computer. I reached out to him under the pretense of wanting copies of old photos of my father. Jake, who had always been kind to me and had often questioned why I seemed to struggle so much despite being talented and hard-working, was happy to help. When Jake sent me the photos, he also mentioned that he had found some weird financial files on my mother's computer, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. I asked him if he still had access to those files. Jake, sensing something was wrong from my tone, agreed to meet me for coffee. At the coffee shop, Jake showed me screenshots he had taken of spreadsheets tracking the inheritance distributions over the years. My mother had been meticulous in her record-keeping, documenting exactly how much of Serafina's money had gone to various family members and expenses. The spreadsheet even included a column labeled Justification with entries like Marcus College Tuition, Investment in Family Future, and Kitchen Renovation, increases property value for eventual inheritance. The most shocking entry was from 2 years ago, Emergency Fund for Serafina, $50,000. I had never received any emergency fund. When I asked Jake about this, he remembered my mother mentioning that they had set aside money for me, but that I was too proud to accept help. The $50,000 had actually been transferred to Marcus for his wedding. Jake was horrified when I explained the situation. He had always wondered why our grandfather's successful bakery seemed to thrive under Marcus while I struggled with basic expenses. As someone who worked in IT, Jake understood the implications of the digital evidence and offered to help me secure everything properly for the legal case. That Sunday morning hours before the family dinner where Marcus would humiliate me, Jake and I met with Patricia to review all the evidence. She was amazed at the thoroughness of the documentation and explained that my mother's own record-keeping would make the case ironclad. She advised me to attend the family dinner as planned, but to record the conversation if possible. Patricia gave me a small recording device and coached me on how to potentially get family members to make incriminating statements. She suggested that I might hint at financial struggles and see how they responded, particularly whether they would offer help they could easily afford using my own money. At the dinner, when Marcus delivered his cruel speech about getting a steady job, I decided to test their reactions. I mentioned that Lily needed dental work that would cost $2,000 and that I was worried about affording it. The family exchanged glances and my mother said, "Well, maybe this will motivate you to find more stable work instead of playing artist." Marcus chimed in, "I learned early that family money should go to responsible investments, not bailing out poor decisions." The irony of his statement, given that his entire life had been funded by my stolen inheritance, was almost too much to bear. Uncle Robert, who I now knew had orchestrated the legal fraud, added, "Your father would have wanted you to stand on your own 2 feet, Serafina. He believed in personal responsibility." This statement was particularly cruel since I had found my father's letter expressing his explicit desire for me to have financial security to pursue my dreams. As I sat there recording their callous responses to my daughter's needs while knowing they could easily solve our financial struggles with money that was rightfully mine, I felt a cold determination settle over me. They had not just stolen money, they had stolen 19 years of dignity, confidence, and opportunities. They had made my daughter grow up watching her mother being treated as the family failure. When I got home that night, I called Patricia and told her I was ready to proceed. We scheduled a meeting for the following morning to begin legal proceedings. I also decided it was time to start building a support network beyond my immediate family. Reaching out to extended family members and family friends who had witnessed years of my struggles and my family's lack of support. The next morning, Patricia and I filed both civil and criminal complaints against my mother Marcus and Uncle Robert. The civil suit demanded full restitution of the inheritance plus interest and damages, while the criminal complaint alleged inheritance fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Patricia estimated the legal process could take several months, but she was confident in our chances of success. However, I knew that legal victory alone wouldn't address the deeper damage done to my relationship with extended family and friends who had witnessed years of my family's treatment of me. I needed allies who could understand the full scope of what had happened and support me through what would undoubtedly be a difficult battle. My first call was to my Aunt Sarah, my father's sister, who had always maintained some distance from my mother's side of the family. When I explained the situation, Sarah was silent for a long moment before exploding in anger. She told me she had suspected something was wrong for years, especially after noticing how differently Marcus and I were treated financially, despite both being my father's children. Sarah revealed that she had actually confronted my father shortly before his death about his estate plans, worried that my mother might not treat his children equally. My father had assured her that he had taken care of everything and that both Marcus and I would be well provided for. Sarah had been confused for years about why I seemed to receive no inheritance, while Marcus clearly had financial support. More importantly, Sarah told me that she had kept copies of some family financial documents from years past, including insurance papers and property records that might support my case. She also offered to reach out to other family members who had expressed private concerns about the disparity in how Marcus and I were treated. Within a week, Sarah had connected me with 3 other family members who agreed to provide statements about the suspicious circumstances surrounding my father's estate and the obvious financial disparities they had witnessed. My cousin David, who was an accountant, offered to review the financial documents and provide professional analysis of the inheritance fraud. But the most valuable ally came from an unexpected source. Jake mentioned my situation to his girlfriend Emma, who worked as a paralegal at a different law firm. Emma had grown up in our neighborhood and remembered my father well. She told Jake that her firm had actually done some legal work for my father's original lawyer, the one who had died in the car accident. Emma discreetly reached out to me and explained that her firm might have backup copies of legal documents from their collaborations with my father's original lawyer. She couldn't promise anything, but she offered to quietly look into whether any records existed that could support my case. 2 weeks later, Emma called me with incredible news. Her firm had found copies of correspondence between my father and his lawyer discussing the specific provisions of his will, including detailed explanations of why he wanted me to inherit the bakery and how he hoped the money would support my artistic career. Even better, they had found a copy of my father's original will with his actual signature, proving that the version Uncle Robert had probated was a forgery. Emma's discovery provided independent corroboration of everything I had found in my mother's attic, but she warned me that her involvement needed to remain confidential until the legal proceedings began, as her firm could face ethical issues for sharing client information, even from a deceased lawyer's files. As word spread carefully through extended family and old friends about the legal proceedings, I was surprised by how many people reached out with their own observations and support. My high school art teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, called to tell me she had always wondered why someone with my talent and work ethic seemed to struggle so much financially. She offered to write a character reference letter describing my dedication and artistic potential. My father's longtime friend and business partner from before he opened the bakery, Mr. Thompson, reached out with memories of my father discussing his estate plans. Mr. Thompson remembered my father specifically mentioning his excitement about leaving me the bakery because he believed I could bring fresh creative energy to the family business. But perhaps the most emotionally significant support came from my daughter Lily's teacher, Ms. Garcia. She had noticed that Lily sometimes seemed worried about money and had observed her declining invitations to birthday parties or school events that required fees. Ms. Garcia offered to write a statement about how financial stress had affected Lily, which could be used to demonstrate the ongoing harm caused by the inheritance theft. As my support network grew, I realized that many people had quietly questioned my family's treatment of me over the years, but hadn't known how to address it. The legal proceedings gave them a framework to finally voice their concerns and support me openly. 3 weeks into building my case, I received an unexpected call from Marcus. His voice was strained as he asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss some family concerns. I agreed to meet him, but I made sure to record the conversation and inform Patricia about the meeting in advance. At the coffee shop, Marcus was clearly uncomfortable. He started by saying he had heard rumors about legal proceedings and wanted to understand what was happening. When I calmly explained that I had discovered the inheritance fraud and was pursuing legal action, his face went pale. Marcus initially tried to deny knowledge of any wrongdoing, claiming he had assumed any financial help from our mother came from her own savings or insurance money. But when I mentioned the detailed spreadsheets I had found, his story began to crumble. He eventually admitted that he had suspected the money might have come from Dad's estate, but had never asked questions because he assumed it was all legal. The conversation took a dramatic turn when Marcus broke down and admitted that the guilt had been eating at him for years. He confessed that he had known about my father's original will and had been present when Uncle Robert and our mother decided to protect me from making poor financial decisions with a large inheritance. They had convinced themselves that giving me the money gradually tied to responsible choices would be better for me. Marcus revealed that there had been multiple family meetings over the years where they discussed my finances and whether to provide me with any support. Each time they had decided that giving me money would enable my artistic pursuits instead of pushing me toward stable employment. They had watched me struggle with rent, childcare, and basic expenses while sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars that belonged to me. The most devastating revelation was that Marcus admitted they had planned to eventually tell me about the inheritance, but only after I had proven my financial responsibility by succeeding without their help. They had essentially been treating my own money as a reward system for behavior they approved of. But Marcus also revealed something that changed my entire strategy. He told me that Uncle Robert had been pressuring the family to resolve the Serafina situation because he was worried about potential legal exposure as he approached retirement. Robert had apparently been researching whether there could be any legal consequences for the inheritance fraud and was becoming increasingly nervous. More significantly, Marcus warned me that our mother and Uncle Robert were planning to claim that my father had actually changed his mind about the inheritance before his death and had asked them to handle his estate differently. They were preparing to argue that the original will didn't reflect his final wishes, even though they had no documentation to support this claim. This information was invaluable for Patricia's legal strategy, but it also revealed that my family was preparing for a fight rather than acknowledging their wrongdoing. Marcus ended the conversation by begging me to consider a family solution that wouldn't involve criminal charges, but I told him that 19 years of lies and financial abuse couldn't be resolved with a private conversation. After leaving the coffee shop, I realized that while I had gained valuable intelligence from Marcus, I had also alerted the family to the extent of my knowledge and preparation. Patricia warned me that they might now take steps to hide assets or destroy additional evidence, so we needed to accelerate our legal timeline. That evening, I called a family meeting of my allies, including Sarah, Jake, Emma, and David. We spent 3 hours reviewing our evidence and coordinating our approach for the formal legal proceedings that would begin the following week. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had a team of people who truly understood the injustice I had endured and were committed to helping me fight for accountability. Just as Patricia was preparing to serve the official legal papers, my carefully built alliance faced a devastating blow that nearly destroyed everything I had worked toward. It came from the person I least expected and trusted most completely. 3 days before we were scheduled to file the formal lawsuit, Emma called me in tears. Through her sobbing, she confessed that she had made a terrible mistake. Her law firm's senior partner had discovered her involvement in my case and had threatened her with termination and potential legal action for breach of client confidentiality. Under pressure, Emma had revealed to her boss the full extent of the evidence we had gathered. But the betrayal went much deeper than professional misconduct. Emma's senior partner turned out to be a longtime golf partner and friend of Uncle Robert. Within hours of Emma's confession to her boss, Uncle Robert knew everything about our legal strategy, the evidence we had collected, and the timeline for our lawsuit. Emma's betrayal had given my family advance warning and time to prepare countermeasures. Within 24 hours, my mother had transferred large sums of money from the inheritance accounts to offshore investments that would be much harder to trace and recover. Marcus had quickly sold his luxury car and used the proceeds to pay down his mortgage, converting liquid assets into protected home equity. Even worse, Uncle Robert had used his legal connections to hire a prestigious law firm specializing in estate defense. They immediately began crafting a narrative that my father had suffered from early-stage dementia before his death, and that the original will reflected impaired judgment. They claimed the family had lovingly managed my inheritance to protect me from my own financial irresponsibility and artistic delusions. The psychological impact of Emma's betrayal was almost as devastating as the practical consequences. I had trusted her completely, sharing my deepest fears and hopes about finally getting justice for my daughter and myself. Learning that she had crumbled under pressure and effectively handed my family a roadmap to defeat me felt like being stabbed by a friend. Patricia was furious about the compromised legal strategy, but determined to push forward. She explained that while Emma's betrayal had certainly made our case more difficult, the fundamental evidence remained strong. However, she warned me that the legal battle would now be much longer, more expensive, and more emotionally brutal than we had originally anticipated. The immediate challenge was that my family's legal team was now requesting extensive depositions from all my allies, clearly hoping to intimidate them into withdrawing their support. Sarah received a letter demanding she provide testimony about every conversation she had ever had with my father regarding his estate plans. Jake was threatened with legal action for computer crimes related to accessing the financial files on my mother's computer. Most devastating was the attack on my cousin David, the accountant, who had offered to analyze the financial evidence. My family's lawyers discovered that David had been through a difficult divorce 2 years earlier and had some minor tax issues during that period. They threatened to report these issues to his professional licensing board unless he withdrew his support for my case. The pressure campaign was working exactly as they had hoped. One by one, my allies began expressing concerns about their continued involvement. David was the first to officially withdraw, explaining tearfully that he couldn't risk his career and his ability to support his own children. Jake's parents pressured him to distance himself from the family dispute, worried that legal complications could affect his immigration status as a green card holder. Even my Aunt Sarah began wavering when my family's lawyers suggested that her own inheritance from my father might be challenged if she continued supporting my lawsuit. They claimed that if the original will was deemed invalid due to my father's alleged mental incapacity, all related estate distributions could be subject to review and potential clawback. Within 2 weeks of Emma's betrayal, my support network had largely collapsed. The coordinated legal intimidation campaign had successfully isolated me and made my remaining allies too frightened to provide active support. I felt more alone than ever facing a well-funded legal machine with only Patricia on my side. But the cruelest twist came when Marcus called me with what he presented as a generous settlement offer. The family was prepared to give me $50,000 and agree to co-sign a loan for Lily's future college expenses, but only if I signed a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and admitted that my accusations of inheritance fraud were misunderstandings based on incomplete information. The settlement offer was insulting on multiple levels. $50,000 represented less than 10% of what they had stolen from me, and the college loan co-signing was meaningless since they could easily afford to pay for Lily's education outright with my own money. The non-disclosure agreement would prevent me from ever talking about the financial abuse and would essentially force me to lie about what had happened to our family. Marcus tried to frame the settlement as a way to heal the family and move forward together, but his tone carried an unmistakable threat. He made it clear that if I rejected their offer, they were prepared to make the legal battle as long and expensive as possible. He suggested that even if I eventually won the legal costs and emotional toll would make it a Pyrrhic victory. That night, as I sat alone in my small apartment with Lily sleeping peacefully in the next room, I seriously considered accepting the settlement. The prospect of years of legal battles mounting attorney fees and continued family warfare seemed almost unbearable. Emma's betrayal had shown me how quickly apparent allies could abandon me when pressure mounted. But as I looked at photos of my father on the wall, I remembered his letter expressing his pride in my artistic talents and his hope that financial security would allow me to build the creative business he believed in. I thought about 19 years of watching my mother and Marcus live comfortable lives funded by money my father had intended for me and my daughter. Most importantly, I realized that accepting the settlement would teach Lily that sometimes injustice prevails when powerful people can intimidate others into silence. I wanted her to learn that standing up for truth and fairness was worth fighting for, even when the battle seemed impossible. The next morning, I called Patricia and told her to reject the settlement offer. We would continue the fight, even if it meant facing my family's legal machine with diminished support. Patricia admired my determination, but warned me that we needed to find new allies and evidence to replace what we had lost through Emma's betrayal. Unknown to me at the time, my decision to reject the settlement and continue fighting would soon lead to the most important alliance of the entire battle, coming from a source I never could have imagined. Just when my case seemed hopeless and my support network had crumbled, salvation came from the most unlikely source imaginable. 2 days after rejecting the settlement offer, I received a call from someone I had never expected to hear from Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, Uncle Robert's former law partner who had retired 3 years earlier. Mrs. Blackwood had heard about the legal proceedings through professional networks and had been wrestling with her conscience for weeks. During our phone conversation, she revealed that she had been present when Uncle Robert had discussed the Serafina problem shortly after my father's death. At the time, she had assumed Robert was handling a routine estate matter, but recent developments had made her realize she had witnessed the planning stages of inheritance fraud. More importantly, Mrs. Blackwood had kept detailed notes from that period because she had been considering leaving the partnership and wanted documentation of all ongoing cases. Her notes clearly showed that Robert had acknowledged the existence of my father's original will and had specifically discussed strategies for managing the inheritance distribution to protect family stability. But Mrs. Blackwood's most explosive revelation was that she had copies of communications between Robert and a document expert who had helped create the fraudulent will. The document expert, thinking he was helping with a legitimate estate modification, had kept records of his work, including detailed notes about matching my father's signature style and paper aging techniques. Mrs. Blackwood explained that her decision to come forward was motivated by learning about the scope of the financial abuse and the impact on my daughter. As a grandmother herself, she was horrified that a child had been forced to grow up in financial insecurity, while her rightful inheritance funded other family members' comfortable lifestyles. Patricia was ecstatic when I shared Mrs. Blackwood's information. Having Robert's former law partner provide testimony about his acknowledgement of the original will and his involvement in document falsification would be devastating to their defense strategy. The communications with the document expert provided independent proof of deliberate forgery rather than any legitimate estate modification. But Mrs. Blackwood offered even more support than testimony. She revealed that Robert had been sloppy about destroying evidence because he had never expected the fraud to be discovered. She guided us to public records and professional filings that would show inconsistencies in Robert's handling of my father's estate compared to his standard practices for other clients. Additionally, Mrs. Blackwood connected me with the document expert who had unknowingly participated in creating the forged will. When Patricia and I met with him, he was mortified to learn that he had been manipulated into participating in inheritance fraud. He immediately offered to provide detailed testimony about Robert's instructions and the specific techniques used to create the falsified document. The document expert also revealed that Robert had contacted him again just 6 months ago, asking about methods for updating old legal documents to make them appear more recently created. This recent contact suggested that Robert had been planning additional document falsification, possibly anticipating that the original fraud might eventually be discovered. Armed with this new evidence, Patricia filed an amended complaint that included additional charges of professional misconduct and conspiracy. The case was strengthened enormously by having Robert's former law partner and the document expert providing testimony that corroborated all our claims about deliberate fraud. But the most satisfying development came when Mrs. Blackwood introduced me to two other families who had suspected Robert of similar estate manipulation tactics. While their cases were different from mine, they provided a pattern of behavior that suggested Robert had made inheritance fraud a regular part of his practice. One family had discovered that Robert had convinced an elderly client to modify her will just weeks before her death, directing a substantial bequest away from her intended charitable donations and toward Robert's own children's education funds. Another family found evidence that Robert had deliberately delayed probate proceedings to allow estate assets to depreciate, then purchased them himself at below-market prices. Patricia realized that we could potentially build a class action case against Robert that would make individual intimidation tactics much more difficult. With multiple families pursuing similar claims, the legal costs could be shared, and the evidence would be much more compelling than any single case. The formation of this broader legal alliance transformed the entire dynamic of my case. Instead of being an isolated individual fighting a well-funded family legal team, I was now part of a group of families seeking justice for systematic estate fraud. The local newspaper picked up the story describing it as a major inheritance fraud scandal involving a prominent local attorney. The media attention brought additional unexpected allies. A retired forensic accountant who had been following the case in the newspaper offered to analyze the financial evidence pro bono, bringing decades of experience in tracking fraudulent asset transfers. A local law professor offered to assist Patricia with legal research, viewing the case as an important precedent for inheritance fraud prosecution. Most significantly, the publicity attracted the attention of the State Bar Association, which launched its own investigation into Robert's professional conduct. This official investigation meant that even if our civil case faced delays, Robert would still face professional consequences that could include disbarment and referral for criminal prosecution. The psychological impact of this expanding support network was transformative. After weeks of feeling isolated and overwhelmed, I suddenly had a team of legal professionals, financial experts, and fellow victims working together toward justice. The intimidation tactics that had worked so effectively against my family allies were useless against experienced professionals who understood the legal system. Within a month of Mrs. Blackwood's initial contact, our legal position had shifted from desperate defense to aggressive prosecution. Patricia filed motions demanding immediate asset preservation to prevent further hiding of inheritance funds and requested expedited discovery to access Robert's complete client files for evidence of additional fraud. The most gratifying moment came when my mother called me for the first time since the legal proceedings began. Her voice was strained and defeated as she asked if there was any way to work this out privately. The confident arrogance that had characterized her treatment of me for 19 years had been replaced by obvious fear about the expanding investigation and media scrutiny. I told her that the time for private family discussions had ended the moment they decided to forge legal documents and steal my inheritance. The case was now about more than just my family. It was about holding Robert accountable for systematic fraud against multiple families and ensuring that other victims could seek justice. The conversation ended with my mother making one final attempt at emotional manipulation, claiming that the legal proceedings were destroying the family and that my father would be ashamed of my actions. I responded that my father would be proud that I was fighting for the justice he had intended through his original will, and that any family destruction was the natural consequence of 19 years of lies and financial abuse. As I hung up the phone, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I felt truly empowered in my relationship with my family. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal support was strong, and the truth was finally emerging after nearly 2 decades of deception. The final phase of the legal battle unfolded with stunning swiftness once all the evidence was assembled and our expanded legal team moved into full action. Within 6 weeks of Mrs. Blackwood coming forward, the combined weight of testimony, forensic evidence, and professional misconduct charges had completely dismantled my family's defense strategy. The first domino to fall was Uncle Robert himself. Faced with potential disbarment criminal fraud charges and multiple civil lawsuits, he attempted to negotiate a plea agreement that would minimize his personal liability. However, his lawyer's attempts to shift blame entirely onto my mother and Marcus were undermined by Mrs. Blackwood's detailed notes proving his central role in orchestrating the inheritance fraud. The State Bar Association moved quickly to suspend Robert's license, pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. The forensic accountant we had recruited discovered that Robert had used similar tactics with at least 7 other families over the past 15 years, making our case part of a much larger pattern of professional misconduct. My mother's resolve crumbled completely when she realized that Robert could no longer protect her from legal consequences. In a dramatic courtroom moment, she broke down during her deposition and admitted that they had hidden my inheritance because they thought I would waste it on art supplies and unrealistic dreams. Her lawyer immediately requested a recess, but the damage was done. Her own words had provided conclusive proof of deliberate fraud and 19 years of ongoing deception. Marcus tried to maintain his innocence longer than the others, claiming he had been manipulated by older family members and had never understood the legal implications of their actions. However, the spreadsheets documenting his extensive use of my inheritance money, combined with his earlier confession to me about knowing the truth, made his defense untenable. The criminal case proceeded rapidly once all 3 defendants realized that fighting the charges would only result in harsher sentences. Robert negotiated a plea agreement that included 2 years in prison, complete restitution to all victims, and permanent disbarment. My mother and Marcus accepted plea deals involving probation, community service, and financial restitution in exchange for their cooperation in the broader investigation. But the civil case results exceeded even Patricia's optimistic projections. The court awarded me full restitution of the original inheritance, plus 19 years of compound interest totaling over $1 million. Additionally, I was awarded punitive damages for emotional distress and the systematic undermining of my financial stability and career development. Most satisfying was the court's order transferring full ownership of the family bakery to me effective immediately. The judge noted in his ruling that my father's original will had specifically intended for me to inherit the bakery, and that my artistic background made me well suited to expand it into the bakery cafe concept my father had envisioned. The financial restitution was life-changing for Lily and me, but the emotional vindication was even more powerful. For the first time in 19 years, I had official acknowledgement that my struggles had not been due to personal failures or poor decisions, but were the direct result of systematic financial abuse by my own family. Within 3 months of the court ruling, I had transformed the family bakery into Serafina's Creative Cakes and Cafe, exactly as my father had hoped. My artistic skills, combined with the traditional baking knowledge I learned from my father as a child, created a unique business that quickly became popular throughout our community. The cafe featured custom celebration cakes that showcased my artistic talents, along with a rotating gallery space where local artists could display and sell their work. I hired 3 full-time employees, including a young single mother who reminded me of my own struggles during Lily's early years. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was in my relationship with extended family members who had watched years of dysfunction without knowing how to help. My Aunt Sarah became one of my closest advisors, helping me navigate the business expansion and serving on the cafe's informal board of directors. Jake and his girlfriend Emma, who had initially betrayed my trust, both reached out to apologize and ask for forgiveness. While I couldn't immediately forget Emma's betrayal, I eventually understood that she had been overwhelmed by pressure from her law firm and had never intended to harm me. Jake remained a loyal friend throughout the aftermath, helping me set up the cafe's digital systems and social media presence. The most unexpected development was the relationship that grew with Mrs. Blackwood, who became a mentor and grandmother figure for Lily. Mrs. Blackwood often visited the cafe and shared stories about my father's personality and dreams that I had never heard before. Her presence helped fill some of the emotional void left by my fractured relationship with my immediate family. The legal victory also opened doors for other inheritance fraud victims who had felt powerless against well-connected lawyers and family members. Patricia and I spoke at several legal conferences about the importance of thorough evidence gathering and building support networks when fighting estate fraud. My relationship with my mother and Marcus remained completely severed, which was painful but necessary for my emotional health and Lily's well-being. I realized that forgiveness might be possible someday, but rebuilding trust with people who had systematically deceived me for 19 years would require genuine accountability and changed behavior that I had not yet seen. The most profound change was in Lily's life and our relationship. Having financial security allowed me to be present for her activities and interests without the constant stress of juggling multiple jobs. She blossomed academically and artistically, inheriting both her grandfather's entrepreneurial spirit and my creative talents. 6 months after the court ruling, I established the Creative Dreams Foundation, using part of my settlement to provide small grants for single parents pursuing artistic or entrepreneurial goals. The foundation's mission reflected everything my father had hoped to achieve by leaving me the inheritance supporting people whose dreams had been deferred by financial struggles. Looking back on this entire experience, I learned that justice sometimes requires patience, strategic thinking, and the courage to stand up to people who seem more powerful than you are. The legal victory was satisfying, but the personal growth and new relationships that emerged from fighting for truth were equally valuable. I also learned that chosen family can be more supportive and loyal than blood relatives who take you for granted. The network of allies who stood with me during the legal battle became the foundation for a richer, more authentic life than I had ever experienced during years of trying to earn my biological family's approval. Today, as I watch Lily help customers at the cafe and experiment with her own cake decorating ideas, I know that my father's dream has been fulfilled in ways he probably never imagined. The inheritance he left me wasn't just about money. It was about giving me the foundation to build a life that honored both my artistic talents and my family's entrepreneurial legacy. Has your family ever hidden important information from you that changed everything when you discovered the truth? Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and fighting for what was right? I would love to hear your stories about family karma, and how justice played out in your situation. Please share your experiences in the comments below. And do not forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with your own family experiences. Make sure to subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family betrayal and finding your own path to success. And please share this video with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes the people who doubt you the most are the ones who benefit from your struggles. Thank you for being part of this community where we support each other through difficult family situations, and remember that your dreams and talents are valid regardless of what anyone else believes about your potential.